Over the years, I've got to know some incredible people, shared dinner with their extraordinary personalities, and sat in awe listening to funny and intelligent talents. And Brian J. Ford is one who has impressed me no end. His new updated book, Non-Science Returns, is a mind-blowing account of Brian's knowledge of the world we are living in. Brian has made me laugh whilst teaching me important lessons in life, one of which is the common sense in photography and video camera work on holiday. And those tips have stayed with me to this day. In 2020, I followed his advice on washing hour shopping, and he probably saved me from getting the virus. But upon reading his latest publication, I've learned that there are more words in the world such as egocentrified, improvementalizationism, and individualistified. But I've not learned to say them, but I have also learned that meteor showers are not worth waiting up for. The Hadron Collider cost $5 billion and is a waste of money, costing $1 billion a year to run. And yet they still haven't created a black hole to swallow us all up, which is what it was built for, right? Yes, this is a different podcast to my normal comedy acts, but I've always enjoyed Brian's company. I have laughed a lot in his presence and enjoyed his humorous lectures. Not only am I proud to know a scientist, but I feel safe having him in my address book. He's a living legend. Welcome to Eyes and Teeth, Brian J. Ford. Welcome to Eyes and Teeth. This is a very, very special edition. I adore this man, and I'm in awe of this man, of his mind, his talent, and his natural humor. Welcome to Eyes and Teeth, Brian J. Ford. Hello.
Well, now, very nice to be here, and good to see you looking in such good form, Steve.
Oh, bless you. Bless you. They can't see this on audio, but
for the benefit of your podcast audience, what I get is a fresh-faced youth, looking intense and sort of engaged, and bubbling over with humour and talent. And it's just a pity this is only audio, because believe me, the beauty of this gorgeosity is what you really need to offset the mellifluousness of his voice.
What was the gorgeous word? I love that.
It was gorgeosity. I thought to myself, do you know, that's a new word. I must remember that and use it again.
You're going to have a few more books by the end of this talk if you keep inventing words like that. I'm very jealous about the collection of your books compared to mine. But you wrote all yours, didn't you? I bought mine.
10 years ago, I decided to give up writing books. I thought, I'd done so many, and I did one 10 years ago. I thought, well, that's about it. And then another book came up, and another book came up, and I've only just had one out. I mean, they just won't go away, Steve, these books.
They won't. Non-Science Returns means that they are coming back, aren't they? And so you very kindly sent me a copy of that. Mind-blowing, the book. That is Non-Science, but Non-Science Returns means that you've updated it, and there's even coronavirus. You're talking about COVID-19 in it, and it's completely updated. Talking about banks crashing and everything, but we'll get onto that. But I want to know what makes Brian J. Ford laugh.
Well, now that's a very good thing. I have to tell you that one of the things that does make me laugh is the kind of thing that nobody else is laughing at. I mean, I can read a scientific paper and slap my forehead with the palm of my hand in the way that they do on comedy stage and say, good God Almighty, they're actually publishing this crap. And I laugh at serious things much more often than I do at anything that's jocular. There are jokes, of course, that always make me laugh. And a good joke is always absolutely a first-rate thing to relish. But jokes are meant to make you laugh. And it's often reading the scientific journals and the appalling tosh that people publish and get millions of pounds in form of grants. And the reason is because of non-science, or as I pronounce it, nonsense. And non-science, the whole point of nonsense is that you con people into giving you money because you use so many long words and such complicated ideas that the people who are giving you the money haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. So they almost give you this huge grant to go away and be quiet. And believe me, there is more humour. That's why the book came out again after 50 years in its updated version, because the original one was published in 1971. And that was just full of the kind of rubbish that people do in science. And now we've been overtaken by it. Everywhere you look, there's all this crap. There's a woman the other day who published a paper saying that there are octopus-like organisms which are orbiting Jupiter. And I'm not joking, that was published by a serious scientist in a serious scientific journal. Now, I mean, what's going to make you laugh more than that, Steve?
So why are they coming up with this stuff? And why do people believe it? Because it's
Well,
printed.
yeah, there was a time when science was all to do with trying to nudge new knowledge from a very unwilling universe and trying to explain things and account for things. But then, about 50 years ago, people began to realise that actually you could make a living out of this. You didn't actually have to do the research. You just have to sound as though you're doing it. And you didn't have to actually do anything good. You just had to make it sound as though it was good. And so if you could come up with all the sort of the right long words and the right confusing ideas, you get a massive grant and swan around the world doing nothing. One example in nonsense is a conference with a range of distinguished looking speakers, and it's on social sciences somewhere, some academic subject. And do you know when it's taking place? It's taking place on a cruise ship across the South Pacific, calling it Tahiti. So it can be all claimed on expenses. And what it really means is that these people are going to be going away, shagging each other senseless with exaggerated exuberation all night long, getting drunk until the early hours of the morning, going to a few lectures. And when they get back, they get all the credit for having been to this social science conference, but it's actually just a luxury gangbang sailing around the South Pacific and getting pissed. And that's what people are actually doing with their money. It's extraordinary.
I have worked with Sir Ken Dodd, and he was known to talk about the science of comedy. And he says, I think there's 27 different types of comedy, whether it's slapstick or stand-up. Or do you know about the science of comedy?
Yes, in fact, I learned as much as you probably did from Sir Ken. He told me that his academic interest in humour went right back to the ancient Greeks, and he was quite extraordinary. You must have found this, you knew him. He was quite extraordinary academic in his approach to humour. He quoted many of the great Greek philosophers and their notion of what made people laugh and so forth. And his knowledge of the history and the slow development of humour and the way to change was quite phenomenal. Now, I don't think he wrote on it, but in fact, a quasi-serious book on humour and how it had changed would, I think, be really interesting. I mean, I'm old enough now to remember when I knew Arthur Askey very well, for example, and what was his name? The name will come back to me. He used to live down in Cheddar, very well known, Frankie Howard. Now, Howard had a sort of interest in humour, but if Ken Dodd had actually written a serious book on the history of humour, then one would have seen some of the reasons for the way that it unfolded, and the fact that people like Arthur Askey and Ken Dodd and others were of a time, and these days to younger people they're not very amusing. Whereas I can watch some of the stuff like Reeves and Mortimer on TV, and I can actually sit there exasperated and think, this is just so childishly unfunny. It is so simplistic. It doesn't demand any mental capacity to appreciate the joke. Whereas you had people like Frank Muir and Dennis Norton, and they had the most extraordinary deep brains. And when they spoke humorously. And when they spoke about humour, they spoke wisely. And it's quite extraordinary to my mind that we don't really analyse humour. It's predominant in all our lives, and yet there's very little academic study of it, or very little scholastic awareness of it. And Ken Dodd was one of the few people I knew who actually had studied the science of humour.
He did, and it is wonderful to actually sit and watch a comedian and think about the joke and then laugh, rather than, like you say, the silly Reeves and Mortimer with their silly style of humour and the childish qualities that had. But I love watching a comedian thinking about it, and I watch people like Ross Noble and Eddie Izzard, and you have to watch from beginning to end to understand the show because it all links together, but that's very clever thinking, that way of producing humor. It's that everyone's different, and I do love different styles of comedy. There's nothing I really am stuck to one genre. It's lots of different styles of comedy, and I think that's why I really enjoyed your lectures, because you mix your lectures with so many different lectures and subjects, and you always inject humor into it, which I love. And that's, I think, why we clicked really in 2002, because you just made me laugh naturally. When you wasn't on the stage, we were just having lunch or standing on the back of the Amazon, on a cruise ship, and it was just, you're just a naturally funny person yourself.
I tell you this, it's a funny thing that you speak of the cruise audience, and it's really quite interesting, isn't it? The cruise audience will never tolerate any profanity or any rude joke at all. I've known people tell jokes that would be regarded as after dinner jokes around a table with friends. And they've been banned from cruise ship company forever because they told a near the knuckle joke. I mean, my favourite cruise joke is one which I couldn't tell on a cruise. And it concerned the two old ladies who were sitting on the afterdeck of a cruise ship. And the one said to the other, "Are you enjoying yourself, my dear?" And she said, "Oh, yes." She said, I'm loving it." And she said, "Have you done any cruises before?" And she said, "No, this is only my second cruise." "How many have you done?" And the lady said, "Oh, I've done 13 cruises. But then," she said, "my husband works forking hard." And she said, "Well, my husband works hard as well, but I can only afford 2 cruises." He works forking hard. Think about it, Steve, it will come.
Yes. That's nice.
But you see, anybody who thought you might be making a double entendre with a rude word in it would have you banned from a cruise ship. And I long to tell jokes like that sometimes in a talk, but I'm afraid you can't get away with it.
Yes, and I believe it's changed even since the pandemic. It's changed with the cancel culture, isn't it? And there's even less things we can talk about now on cruise ships, and you have to adjust your act now. If you're a comedian, you have to adjust your act wherever you go back to work. And it was difficult enough as it was on cruise ships, but now if you're on television, if you're doing a theatre, you just have to step very carefully, don't you?
It's now become bizarre. I mean, the greatest racist areas of the world that exist are Africa and Asia, and yet the Africans and the Asians in Britain are always the first to complain about racism. I mean, in Africa, racism involves the murdering of people of a slightly different culture. The way in which it's gone is really quite bizarre. And there is so much talk of slavery back in the 1600s, when of course it was a global trade. And yet there are more slaves now than there were then. And people seem to turn a blind eye to that. I think we've become so obsessed with trying to look back to earlier eras where terrible things happened, but values were different and certain things that people did were accepted, and make capital out of it whilst turning our backs on the much bigger real problems that we're surrounded with today. And I do find that concerning. I also find it bothersome that people believe so many things that manifestly aren't true. I'll give you one example, because it's actually in my book. And that is the idea that the Amazon is making the oxygen that we breathe. And as we destroy the Amazon, we're going to destroy the atmosphere. No, the oxygen in the air that we breathe comes from some 2.4 billion years ago, when the algae were pumping oxygen into the air, and it's still there now. If you burnt every tree and everything that's combustible in the world, it would have hardly any effect on reducing the level of oxygen. Now, nobody seems to know that. They all say trees make oxygen, and of course they do as they grow. But if you're in a rainforest and you're an old tree, you die and you fall down and you rot away. And by the time you've completely rotted away, the microbes that decompose you draw in every atom of oxygen that you originally produced as you grew. So between germinating seed and the last bit of the dead tree rotting away, the tree leaves no oxygen in the air at all. And yet everywhere online you will find sites saying the Amazon rainforest makes 20% of the oxygen we breathe. It doesn't. It has no effect on the level of oxygen. And yet entire meetings, conferences, books, programs, journals, magazines, newspaper articles and campaigns are all based on this myth. It's the ignorance of people for the most basic concepts of understanding that really does bother me. And of course kids don't learn this in school. You go to school and you learn a complete load of irrelevant rubbish. Nobody teaches you in school the things you need to know, like how to run a flat, how to cook a meal. They've just been complaining about parents who aren't teaching their kids at home when the schools are all closed. Has anybody in a modern school in Britain ever been taught how to bring up a child? Has anybody ever taught how you do home learning? We teach kids all sorts of stuff they're never going to need again, like Shakespeare and algebra, but we don't teach them the skills they need. I think the whole idea of going to school now is completely out of date. All the knowledge and information you want on the web. However, we're getting into controversial territory here, young Steve.
Yes, what is the punchline to all that?
Oh, controversial.
Yeah, it's the sad thing, isn't it, really? I mean, comedy, where is comedy going? So what can we say, what can't we say? And it does go that deep, as deep as you did go. It's gone back to the rainforest, Yes, it's very, very sad, but we do need oxygen to laugh, I guess. So it's nice that we have that. I have two children, as you know, Brian, and it's very worrying. Are they learning anything that they need to know to go out there in the big wide world? It's quite worrying as a parent. And my Nina, over the last year, she'd done most of the homeschooling, but I was here helping with the homeschooling and the cooking. And it was very worrying, but Nina worked so hard to make sure that everything that was sent to us, that the kids did actually learn, but are they going to remember any of that and take it into the big wide world? We're not sure.
Well, kids learn. I mean, I learnt far more out of school than I ever did in it. I mean, I used to skive off sports afternoons to go home and do experiments in my lab. And I taught myself far more science than I ever learned by going to school.
Yes. Wow. No, I believe that. With comedy, do you know why it is that funny people are often sad inside, aren't they? You see the case of Robin Williams. And did you know if there's a science behind that? But why a lot of funny people are quite introverts, really, when they're off stage? They're just sad people. Do you know, is there a reason for that? Or is it just all individual cases are different?
It's probably, as you say, individual cases. I'm quite sure that there are schools of psychiatry making millions of pounds out of grants in studying all of this. But the fact is, of course, that we know this from the comics that you and I have known, that many of them are, in fact, sad and morose and thoughtful and deep people. And by acting crazy in public, they are able in some way to compensate for their private inner grief. Spike Milligan on air could hardly find a wackier or crazier person than Spike Milligan. But he was, by all accounts. I mean, I knew Harry Seacombe, though I didn't know him. But Milligan was, by all accounts, a very morose and inward character. And so it may well be that standing on a stage and having the exuberant support and approval and affirmation of an audience in some way gives you a sense that, you see, I do matter after all. And then after it, you can go back to your normal morose self. I had to say, I'm not terribly morose. My great problem is that I'm always the same. And Harry Seacombe was always the same. There are people who are just the same whether they're on stage or off it. But there are other people, one knows, who are really morose and gloomy. And yet the moment that the announcement comes and that spotlight goes on and they walk into the centre of the stage and that's a great wave of applause and cheers comes up from the audience, suddenly they become alive. And when they step off the stage, they go back to their normal selves again. But no, I'm just the same. I mean, at 3 o'clock in the morning, if I wake up to go to the loo, or if I'm in a supermarket or in a restaurant or on stage, I'm afraid Ford is just Ford, and you're just bloody well stuck with it, whether you like it or not. I just hope people do.
And they do like it. I've seen people convulse with laughter in your lectures, and and the subjects, they shouldn't be laughing, but you bring them in, and your personality just, it spreads. It spreads happiness, and you do get the message across because you bring humor with it. You talk about subjects, and people do, they go with it, and I've learned things from your lectures because not because you've made me laugh, but I believe you. You're a wonderful scientist, and the books that you've put out there are just incredible. But you are naturally funny as well. So I remember a certain lecture that you did on photography and video camera work on holidays. And to this day, I still say to Nina, I say, no, don't put that in the center. You stand at the side. I get more. And I remember these certain things. Well, don't record everything. Just record a certain bit on the video camera or on the phone these days. There's certain things that have stuck out in a lecture which I saw 19 years ago.
That's so funny because last year I was lecturing on seaborne in the Caribbean. The guy came up to me and I had my camera and he said to me, he said, if you're going to take that shot, there's 3 things you need to remember. He said, hang on a minute, isn't it Professor Ford? And I said, yes. He said, oh, sorry, I was going to quote you something from your lectures. You said it on the Braemar in 2003. And I was just, because I thought, well, at least some bugger has actually remembered something all those years later. And I'm delighted to think you did too. My gosh.
Do you know what, the millions of people that you have lectured for over the years, they've got this in their head, that they've said, oh no, Brian's told us this, and this has to, I'm always quoting you when I'm either taking the pictures or certain things, and it's wonderful. It must make you proud that people are listening and remembering.
Well, when I used to do a lot of radio, the greatest compliment I ever had, and it happened quite often, was that one would be in a shop, for example, or in a restaurant or somewhere, and somebody would come up and immediately say, "Oh, I recognise that voice." Now that always gave me a little buzz. People who used to come up to me all the time and say, "Oh, I saw on television last night," that used to really piss me off. But if ever people came up to me and said, "I heard you on the radio last week," I used to beam within a pleasure. Now, I've never really understood why that is. I just recorded an audio book from an American publisher about viruses, and they have sent lovely polite comments and asked me if I'd do some more. Don't like recording audio books. I might not do anymore. It's a complete pain in the arse. But at least it's done now, and it's something I'd never done before. I've done so many things in life that if somebody says to me, "Would you like to undertake some task which you've never done previously?" I will always rub my hands physically and say, "Oh, yes, something new to do. This is going to be exciting."
So you fresh. You obviously don't mind going over the old, but you do like discovering new things. And
oh yeah,
yes. And are you still discovering new things? What is the last thing you discovered?
Well, I've just been looking at the way that living cells behave through the microscope and demonstrating the intelligence of living cells. My little microscope is by me as we speak. Well, rather my big microscope. And currently, for example, I've just been making an animation down the microscope to show the size of a human hair, and then we see cells, and then we see bacteria, and then we see the coronavirus. So you actually have a zoom right in from something you can see with your naked eye to something you can't. And for the first time, it gives you a real indication of how tiny a virus is. That has never been done before in that way. And I'm quite pleased. It's vivid and quite exciting.
Oh wow! So you are discovering. That's incredible. Oh, I can't wait to see that. Is that something that's going to be published?
Yes, well, I'll certainly put it online. I'll mention it to a producer or two because we might even do it on TV. But I shall make absolutely certain that I inform you in advance of its appearance. There you go. Can't be fairer than that, Steve.
I remember being on the back of a cruise ship when we were actually on the Amazon River. We were standing on the back of...
I remember that.
Yes, I do remember. And we were cruising and we're drinking champagne. And this sounds lovely. I'd love to be able to do this now. You dropped a glass. And what was the point of you dropping the glass? It was science, the reason you did this.
Yes.
Into the water on the back of the ship.
You really mustn't drop things off. But of course, I mean, a glass is fairly innocuous because it's not going to pollute anything. It's an inert material. But the whole point of dropping it was to show that the glass was moving forward with the ship, because people thought that if you dropped something, it would land in the water where you'd been. And I was explaining that no, it would land in the water where you were going. And that was the point of it. And indeed, the glass fell down, maintaining its position relative to the ship, rather than moving backwards behind the ship, as everybody else seemed to think it would. So it was a useful little experiment. I very much hope they remembered it.
It was brilliant.
If a child one day opens the back door of their car and falls out, they'll know when they jam on the brakes roughly where to go and find the little bugger.
And shortly after that experiment, though, you remember the ship got sandbanked and we got stuck.
God, well, that was so funny. We were coming out, yes, one of those Amazon cruises.
Yes, we hit a glass, I think.
Could have been. No, we were coming out at good speed, about sort of 24 knots or something, coming out of the Amazon, with the pilot on the bridge, and the ship suddenly stopped as though it hit a wall. It had run onto a sandbank. And all the lights went off, if you remember, and it felt as though the ship was rolling right over. And everybody screamed. And of course, then what happened was that there was no announcement from the bridge at all. And everybody rushed up to me and said, "Brian, what's been happening?" And I wanted to say, well, how the fuck? I mean, I'm sitting here the same as it. But I said, well, clearly we have just run aground on a sandbank. And they said, well, how can that be? And I said, well, the sandbanks do change all the time. You know, the Amazon is a mighty river, and it forms a huge delta, and there are huge droves of sand that move about all the time. But of course, the funny thing was that because we were going at speed, he couldn't get off, if you remember. So he had the bright idea of running, first of all, the port screw, and then the starboard screw alternately, so the ship was sort of wiggling a little bit. And after about half an hour, it did come loose. And the next day, the captain, do you remember this, Steve? He came on, ding dong, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain. Well, first I need to say a little word about last night when we kissed the sandbank. Now, and I saw him at lunchtime, and I said, Master, what's all this crap about kissed the sandbank? And he said, look, I don't even know if I've got a job at the moment. He said, we ran aground. That's the worst thing you can do. And I said to him, but it's your use of kissing the sandbank. You must have spent all night working that out. I said, what happens if my wife takes BMW out and bangs into a wall? Is she going to come home and say, I kissed the brickwork? But no, that was funny.
That was brilliant. Lovely description. And it was nice. There's somebody kissed the sandbank in the Suez Canal a few weeks ago, didn't they?
They kissed both sandbanks at once, which was quite a trick.
They shagged it silly, didn't they? No, also on that cruise, I introduced you to a new puppet that I got that week, and you helped me come up with not just a name for the puppet, but you helped me write some material. We wrote some jokes, and I put it on that week. Now, it was a parrot puppet. Do you remember the parrot?
Yes, and you had all sorts of names for it, and I said, it's an obvious name. And you and Nina said, what's that? And I said, Jasper Parrot. And indeed, he became Jasper ever since. I don't think he'd work nowadays, because dear Jasper Carrot, very funny man. Dear Jasper Carrot is no longer working, so I dare say that anybody under the age of 30 is going to say, why did you call your parrot Jasper? And by the time you explain, you needn't have bothered. So I'm sure the name probably doesn't work now. But is he still performing, Jasper the Parrot?
No, he's no longer with us. But it was lovely. Oh. The meat fell off the bone, you know.
I was just going to say, it'd be a change from turkey every Christmas.
Yes. No, I gave it to a friend actually who had a jungle puppet show, and he put it in the show, and I didn't see it again, so I let it go. But it was wonderful. The wings would. I've got a picture of us on the back of that very ship with Jasper Parrot.
I remember.
Yeah, I'll put that out.
Eyes and teeth.
You've tackled so many different subjects, Brian, and even evolution of giant dinosaurs. That's fascinating for a young boy, a 45-year-old boy. It's brilliant. So it's just brilliant. And I talk about a few of the subjects that you've written about. Human combustion. Is that something that actually does happen or has happened?
Yes. I mean, the dinosaur theory was interesting because, and if you're still wondering what to do with your Christmas book token, do they still have book token, listener? Then dash off to Waterstones. Oh, they're open again now, I think, and buy yourself a copy of the book. Too Big to Walk, it's called. Just think of a great, huge, fat lady. I don't suppose you're allowed to say that these politically incorrect days. Think of a big, fat lady, and you'll think too big to walk. The point is that the giant dinosaurs, I postulate, actually in my 20s, must have evolved in an aquatic habitat where the water would support the weight of their bodies. The largest organisms that we have are elephants, and the biggest that we know of in human memory would be mammoths. I mean, about 10 tons, possibly even 12 or 14. But some of these dinosaurs were over 100 tons in weight. And I'm afraid the mathematics doesn't work out. They've done work at Manchester University showing that the ability of a dinosaur weighing 100 tons, even to stand up, would be theoretically impossible. And of course, the only reason that there was an impetus, an imperative to get them to evolve so big is because they were living in shallow water that supported their weight. The one thing dinosaurologists never talk about is how dinosaurs could copulate. And of course they couldn't. If you imagine a 100-ton dinosaur leaping with great joy upon his mate and her hind legs supporting 200 tons, and it's utterly bizarre. Clearly they mated whilst supported in water. And then a friend of mine in America, who's a great climatologist, they said, your theory actually solves all our problems with the Cretaceous, because there are lots of facts and figures that don't add up in the Cretaceous. But if we imagine that the world was covered with shallow water, or mostly covered with shallow water, as I'm certain it was, then our models make sense. So in fact it led to a complete revision of the Cretaceous climate model that we had. And of course the extinction of the dinosaurs was because at that time the continents started to drift, and India crashed into Asia and threw up that crumpled zone that we call the Himalayas, and the Pacific plate crashed into the South American plate and threw up that crumpled zone that we call the Andes Mountains. And as the continents began to shift and drift, you began to get rivers and deep oceans and those vast shallow lakes and seas went away, and I think it was therefore habitat loss that caused the dinosaurs to become extinct. And it's all very carefully argued and set out. The paleontologists, who of course get their grants for believing that these dinosaurs ran around like oversized gazelles pounding across the prairie, they're really pissed off with my theory, because it means that all of their work has been pointless. So I'm afraid I'm persona non grata amongst the paleontological fraternity. But human spontaneous combustion is certainly real, yes. I did suggest some years ago that it could be because the body produces acetone, which is highly inflammable. I mean, it was proved, I think in 1870 by a scientist called Justus von Liebig, that the popular theory, which is that it's alcoholics who undergo spontaneous human combustion, that can't be right. He said, because I store my flesh specimens, my mammalian tissue specimens, in 70% alcohol. And 70% alcohol is more in the body than even you and I would get out on a bender, Steve. And he said, if you try to set fire to them, they won't burn. So it's obvious, he said, quite obvious to me, that whatever causes spontaneous human combustion cannot be alcohol. And so I just set out to think, well, what other chemical could it be? And the body does produce acetone. Sometimes if you're nursing a teething baby, you can smell acetone. It smells like nail varnish remover on the breath. Or somebody with diabetes will sometimes have a trace of acetone on the breath. And so I reasoned that possibly the acetone builds up in the fatty layers of the body's tissues, and then a static spark or something could ignite the vapour and the person could burn. So we did some experiments with 1/12 sized people made of belly pork and dressed properly and seated in little rooms. It was the same as the kind of rooms where the dead bodies had been found. And indeed we found that if the tissue was soaked in alcohol, it wouldn't burn. It smelled very nice, made you think, gosh, we must have a barbecue. But if it was acetone, then it would burn almost explosively. So that was published, and it is the only explanation so far of how it might happen. But the popular view has always been, no, it's just an invention, or they burnt very slowly, they fell unconscious, and then their burning clothes melted the fat in their bodies, the so-called wick effect. But that would take 30 hours.
Yeah, it seems impossible.
Did the explode in half an hour or so? And that's what we found with our experiments. Yeah, we had the Discovery Channel and all those other people here, and on ITV, the delightful Julia Bradbury came round and almost had her eyebrows burned off. So, yes, it became a very interesting little project.
It's fascinating. I picked a couple of fascinating subjects that I was interested in. And I imagine with the combustion, it's people that are embarrassed in situations, they want the ground to swallow them up. Maybe it's happened after they've said that and it's a wish come true. I don't know. So are there genies involved? That's me trying to attempt humour. And science, it doesn't work. Other subjects you write about: forensic science, control of biohazards, foot and mouth, the future of food, head lice. Now, head lice is one that I would know about because we went through all that at school, and
yeah.
What is it they say? They say about if you've got clean hair, you will get it. If you've got dirty hair, you won't. You think it would be the other way around.
Yes, head lice are quite interesting because when you look at them, if you get a specimen of a head lice, and he moves quite slowly, he looks quite ponderous, almost like a tortoise. They go sort of just scratching about. But under the microscope, I took a video of it, I think it's online. The front claw can sort of extend, like reaching your arm out. It has quite a big claw, rather like a lobster's claw, only of course infinitesimally small. But it opens its claw, and then this front limb shoots out, hooks around, and comes back in again, very fast. And so if there is a hair, it will grab onto it. And that's how they get them out. I don't think it's true that head lice spread more easily through clean hair than dirty. The point is that they are not a sign of having dirty hair. If you pick up head lice from somebody, whether the hair's clean or dirty, you'll get it. And kids just do. And I did smile earlier when you spoke of Nina being busy at home with her 2 children. And I thought, well, from what I know of you, Steve, it's 3 children. And I'm sure that her hands are just as full with you as they are with the kids.
Yes, I have mentioned that I am her 3rd child. Because I said that we, at one time we did want to have a son and a daughter. We ended up with 2 daughters who we adore. And I said, well, I guess in a way you did have a son, because I am your 3rd child, So no, you're completely right. and you know me well.
I see over your shoulder, you see, again, you can't see this, listener. This is the terrible limitation of the dreadful audio blog. But there is a book. This is Paul Daniels' book I see over your shoulder. Other shoulder.
Yes,
Steve, he's looking the wrong way. Typical bloody Steve. I knew Paul very well. Indeed, I was once the after-dinner speaker at the Magic Circle's annual dinner, would you believe? Paul, he was a miserable bastard, was Paul. He really was. He'd get up everybody's tits. He was the most chip-on-the-shoulder northerner you could ever wish to meet. He really was. But what a talent he had. His ability for sleight of hand was really quite extraordinary. I mean, I remember once he did a trick, and there are many versions of this trick. All the magicians at home will say, yeah, we know that, Brian, we do it. But you take a £10 note, and somebody signs it, and then the trick goes on, and eventually it ended up with Paul Daniels picking up an egg and cracking an egg into a glass. And instead of there being a yolk in the egg, there was a walnut. And so he took out the walnut and dried it with a tissue and gave it to somebody to crack open, and they cracked it open with a nutcracker, and inside was the signed £10 note that the man had given him earlier with the corner torn off, and it fitted the corner. I mean, we all know how it's done. It's done by sleight of hand. It's done by misdirection and by manipulation, by prestidigitation, as conjurers say. But it is so incredibly cleverly done, and I would much prefer to believe it was magic than to think it was just done by some bloke. Now, dear Paul, I do miss him. Still in contact with Debbie.
Yeah,
He was a very talented man, and I enjoyed his company enormously. We had great fun.
yeah. I done a 6-week pantomime with him and Debbie in about 6-7 years ago. We had a wonderful time, and he didn't do that trick, but he did do many card tricks every day. He'd walk up with a new card trick and a couple of jokes. There's wonderful people in this business, you know, and humor is a very important part of this podcast, and you're talking about so many wonderful people that have got a sense of humor. What is the April Fool's joke for television that you worked on?
I didn't do one this year. I didn't do one last year either. I haven't done an April Fool's joke every year, but I have done them most years, and they're always good fun to do. Yes, I did a great one for the BBC on radio, where I explained that terrestrial television caused dandruff. And I pointed out that the sale of anti-dandruff shampoo exactly correlated with the sale of television sets. And that what was happening, that each hair was acting as a dipole aerial and was actually picking up signals. And that caused the irritation that resulted in the dandruff. And so if you went to places like Siberia, where they didn't have any terrestrial television, dandruff was entirely unknown. And because we had more time on this programme than the presenter or the producer anticipated, I went on further and I said how there was a case of a person who actually was picking up radio signals by a similar dipole aerial in the filling in their teeth. And they found that if they leant over the wok that they were cooking with, it would act as a concave reflector, and they could actually pick up the archers on a Sunday morning whilst cooking the meal if they held their... And so we went on and elaborated this. It was all completely spontaneous. But the television one was one where I simply said that matter did not exist. Matter was simply a substance that occupied the space between holes, and it was the study of holes that was really important. And so I said, for example, people think that rubber wears off a tyre, but that's not true. What actually happens is, if you look at a newly laid road, an asphalt road, it's pitted with lots of little tiny holes. As time goes by, it gets to be very smooth and mirror-like because the hole has been pressed onto the tyre. So although the tyre seems to wear down, it's not a loss of rubber. It can't be, because if it was, as a number of cars, there'd be massive great drifts of black powdery rubber all over the place. Huge drifts of rubber if it was wearing off the tyres. No, what's happening is hole is being worn onto the tyre rather than rubber is being worn off. And I said, people can find them and experiment for themselves. You can buy them in bulk from any wholesalers. And so we made this television programme. What they didn't know, and what nobody's known until me telling you now, is I actually wrote that as a school magazine article when I was a sixth former. I wrote it as a joke. I called it The Whole Truth. And it's published in a school magazine when I was about 16 or 17 years old.
That's brilliant.
And so what actually happened was that the ITV people said, would you like to do an April Fool's joke? And I thought, what the... yes. And they said, what would you do? And I said, I would do a theory. And I then told them about the whole theory, because it was all I could think of from my school days. And they actually gave me a 5-man crew for 3 days to go around and make this. We filmed at Cambridge University and all over the place.
Brilliant.
Nowadays, some sort of gauche person who's hardly started shaving, or if a lady hasn't yet started her periods, turns up with a handheld camera, not sure where to stick the microphone, and they do the interview and run away again. In those days, you had a 5-person crew with a focus puller and a sound assistant, and they absolutely marvellous.
Brilliant. That's so funny.
So that's the last time I ever worked with a really big film crew. But yes, we've still got a tape of it somewhere. It's not online, but it ought to be. I'll try and put it up for you, Steve.
Eyes and teeth.
I've always been fascinated with this, but it's come out a lot more recently in the last year, I think, because there's a lot of conspiracies out there, Brian, about UFOs and flying saucers. Now, Donald Trump, the past president, did not reveal it. You think he would in one of his crazy moments. But do you know are there UFOs? Are there? Is any of this? Does it exist? Because my dad, when he was 19, living on a farm, he was on his deathbed about 7 years ago, but he's still with us. That deathbed was not a deathbed. He had a couple of heart attacks, and he said that he would. He wanted us to know that it's in a UFO. I think he thought, okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to tell everybody, my secrets. So he said, I saw a UFO when I was a kid. So is this nonsense? Is it nonsense?
Well, there are different ways of looking at it. The point is that, one is instinctively inclined to say, no, of course not, it's just a load of drivel. It's like ghosts and werewolves and anything else. But the point is this. If you look at the number of celestial bodies that exist in space, they're so incalculably large that to imagine that there is only one place anywhere where any form of life ever existed, namely on Earth, would seem to be statistical nonsense. Against that is the fact that there have never been any reliable findings. There have been things like the Roslin incident, where people insist that everything was hidden up. It may have been, who knows. But there's no evidence that it ever has been. On the other hand, I did a television program in the 60s, and one of the people who gave a vivid description of seeing a UFO, quite close up, was, I think it was the medical officer of health for Swansea, a most respectable and dignified and rather taciturn and shy elderly gentleman. And his whole reputation would be buggered if he said so. And I had to persuade him to come on the programme and describe, a bit like your dad, thinking, people need to know this, but I'm embarrassed to tell them. And there have been reports recently released which show, apparent floating bodies up at high altitude, filmed by American Navy pilots and others, which do seem to show strange things. So if anybody said to me, do you believe in them? I'd say, well, casually, no. But if anybody said, is it impossible for them to exist? I'd say, well, I had to say no to that too. Because in statistical terms, it cannot surely be that we are the only place in the universe where any form of intelligent life has evolved. The trouble is, of course, that we keep thinking they've got to be a bit like us. I remember when they sent up, was it the Mariner spacecraft, and they put a picture inside of a naked man and a woman raising their hands in greeting, so that if it actually turned up and was found by some space person in far distant part of the universe, they'd realise we were friendly. And I said, well, they may themselves make missiles that are like people with a hand up. And so from that point of view, they might interpret it as being a sign of warlike intent on our part. I mean, how bizarre to think that anybody would assume that a human-made picture is relevant to them. But no, the UFO thing is really very much up in the air. It's not a thing one can talk about because there is no evidence. But to be categorical and say, no, they can't exist, would be the ultimate in hubris. We surely cannot be the only place in the universe where this sort of chemistry has given rise to life.
Yeah, that's true. Great answer. Wow. A couple of weeks ago, Uri Geller was on the news and he wanted to, I think he was in a newspaper, and he wanted everybody to connect, fix the royal family using his mind and our minds.
Yeah.
Now, if it's something that was possible, surely we can all do the same thing, but to try and fix the planet and get rid of the virus.
Come on now. I was once with him and he was doing his spoony thing and I thought, go on, that's just a fatigue fracture. But then he said to people, he said, I can make these seeds germinate. And indeed, he had wheat seeds, and about 10 minutes later, they were germinated in his hand. So he said to me, you biologists don't understand this, but believe me, he said, this sort of thing is really very important to realise that I can do. And he showed me them, and they were completely dead and mangled and dried up, looking very, very... He'd obviously germinated seeds a day or two before and had them in his pocket ever since, and they were all withering away to nothing. I mean, it was sleight of hand. But we are doing quite well to get rid of the virus as it is. I mean, the miraculous way in which people suddenly leapt into RNA vaccine research and came up with these vaccines. I'm very relieved to have my 2 shots, and my wife has been relieved to have hers too, feel a lot more protected. No, there's no easy answer to that. And metaphysics, I'm afraid, does not impress me. But UFOs have to remain a bit of a sort of open question.
Oh, confusion.
Last year when the pandemic was going on, I saw some of your videos and I started to wash my shopping because of you. And you may have stopped me from getting the virus because I was very cautious, and Nina always made sure I washed it all. We washed everything when we came back. And so thank you.
I would have to say I laugh at that video now because, of course, now we know what to do. My best advice now, I think, would be the wearing of cotton gloves. You know, the kind of thin white cotton gloves that people use when they examine old documents or whatever it may be. We always wear cotton gloves as well as a mask when we go out, because masks cannot work in one way. Masks clearly will help. They will certainly tend to stop inhaling droplets containing viruses, sure. But the hole in the fabric mask that most people wear is far too big to stop viruses. It may shock you to realise that if the virus is the size of a lentil, right? You picture a little lentil in your hand. The size of the holes in the conventional face mask is the size of a railway tunnel. Now, it is inconceivable that that can stop all virus particles. And masks, although they certainly help, are not ever going to stop all virus particles getting through to you. But when the droplets settle out, they always settle onto surfaces. And they have done some early research showing that the virus can last for weeks on surfaces. Right. And so I think rather bizarre that we wear a mask that we know has limited use, and yet we put our hands on everything. And although they say, you know, wash your hands, you then go and open the door handle that you just came in with and pick up all the virus particles that you left on the door handle when you closed the door. So what we always do is to wear gloves. But no, we don't wash our shopping anymore. We do, if anything is suspect, wipe it with a dilute bleachy cloth. But we do always wash our hands after we handle the mail, for example, or anything like that. But those early videos that I made were when nobody knew anything about the virus, and it seemed as though it might, first of all, have quite a high lethality and certainly be massively abundant. And now we know the limits on its spread, and we understand much more about the limits on its transmissibility. So the extreme precautions I was taking then I wouldn't recommend anybody to do. But Carol Vorderman said, yes, she was doing it too. Indeed, she told me that Good Morning Britain wanted to feature it on TV, and she was quite horrified when, in the end, they didn't. Though I've done a couple of BBC interviews on it, though nothing on TV.
You prefer radio, though, don't you? I finished editing the first draft of my book now, writing a book on ventriloquists. And so in your book, Non-Science, is a wonderful, wonderful read. But there is a chapter all about publishing a book in there. So thanks for the advice. That's fantastic, because I need it. So,
do you have a publisher?
No, not yet. Not yet. I'm at the early stages. I've never written a book, and I'm now at, I'm just getting all the pictures in order, and then start looking for a publisher and see who would be interested.
Well, the collating is something that, of course, nobody can advise you on. The collating is just important. What you need to do for anybody thinking of writing a book, what you need to do is get all your artwork together, make sure you have the permissions. If they're old pictures, you don't, and of course if they're new pictures, it's handy to have something in writing from somebody to say they're happy for you to use it. then save all the pictures as nice big JPEGs. Make sure they're at least, say, 3,000 pixels along the long side, or publishers won't like them. But the one tip I would give to you, Steve, and I would say to anybody listening who's toying with the idea of writing a book, never, ever submit a manuscript to a publisher. Only ever submit an outline of the book on maximum 2 sides of A4. Because if the publisher likes the idea of the book, then the publisher thinks, right, I've got to get this person to write this book. And so they'll come up with a nice advance for you and a nice general. If you've written the book, then the boot is on the other foot. It's now a buyer's market instead of a seller's market. If you've written the book, then they think, well, they've done the work and they now want me to publish it. So therefore I can be as nasty as I want to the author. And if the author's got a book they're willing to write, then it's up to me as a publisher to get them to write it. So you should never, ever submit a manuscript to a publisher. I may say that the majority of big publishers these days will not accept any manuscript anyway from an author. They all go through agents. I've never used agents. I had a couple of agents that I knew and who I would be happy for them to represent me, but they just weren't any good. I always deal directly with publishers. But most publishers nowadays will only accept a book through an agent. So if you can find an agent, that's really quite a good idea. Otherwise, if you want to approach a publisher, you should go to a big bookstore like Waterstones and go to the section which has books like the one you want to publish and have a look at the publishers, because then you need to write to one of those publishers and say, I see you've published this book, that book and the other book, and my book might fit quite well on your list. Because if you know the publisher is in the market for books rather like, say, the history of showbiz, then they'd be very likely to be looking for a new title to go into their list.
Yes, wonderful advice.
Your favourite publisher, who may have published books you've liked in the past, would never dream of publishing something in that field, and so there'd be no point in going to them.
Oh, contributional.
Is laughter the best medicine, Brian?
Well, without a doubt. I mean, it is a fact that people who are chirpy do tend to do much better than people who are chirpless. Whether laughter is the best medicine, the Pfizer vaccine is quite a decent medicine, and so indeed is penicillin. I wouldn't have a word said against it. But somewhere up there in the top 5 must be laughter. If you are light in spirit and you see the humour in life and you just enjoy the fun of being alive, then you're likely to go on doing it for longer. And yes, laughter, if it isn't the best medicine, it's certainly a really, really good one, and it's something we all need.
That was amazing. Brian J. Ford, thank you so much for your time today. And I can't follow that. That was just a wonderful description. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to talk to you. Brian J. Ford, thank you.
My pleasure. Any old time, Steve. And lots of love to you and, of course, to Nina, and especially to the kids.
Oh, bless you. I'll tell Jasper you said hi. Take care.
Ice and Teeth.
Thanks to Brian J. Ford, not only a genuinely intelligent but clever, generous and funny and kind man. Brian's books are fascinating. The man himself is a wealth of knowledge. You are going to want to research him, so please go to www.brianjford.com. Or you can go to Brian's Facebook page, which is brianjford.science, and at Brian J. Ford on Twitter. His YouTube video on meeting coronavirus is very interesting. Today's quote comes from Professor Stephen Hawking. When Stephen Hawking was asked what life advice he had given to his children, this was his response. 1. Remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet. 2. Never give up work. Work gives you meaning and purpose, and life is empty without it. 3. If you are lucky enough to find love, remember it is there, and don't throw it away. Eyes and Teeth is written, produced and hosted by Steve Hewlett. Vocals by Lola, Larissa and Nina Hewlett. Additional vocals by Rich T. The Eyes and Teeth music and jingles are all produced and performed by Kevin Dean. Thank you so much to my guest Brian J. Ford. Thank you to all my guests. For me, this is therapeutic to talk to friends, talk to people I admire, just to have a laugh. So I really appreciate you being on board. Join me next time on Eyes and Teeth, Voices of Variety, when I talk to voiceover artist, pantomime favourite, actress, and my future co-radio presenter. She's done the lot. It's Claire Sloan.